Steve, thank you very much for sparing us some time this morning, and we're very privileged to have you and your intellect and your insights available to us to pass on to the students. So maybe we can just start off with, can you talk us through how you came into the geospatial world and maybe some of the things that you point to as achievements during that time?
I actually, my first degree was French, German, Russian, and Spanish. And then I flipped to do what was called information systems at the time. So this would probably be the early days of computer science. And so in the early 90s, I was introduced to a company called Oceanics, which was bought by Fugro, who are now still around and huge. And that was by my sister, who had a friend working there on what was broadly called IT stuff at the time. So I worked there with experts who were building differential GPS early correction receivers, and that was for offshore satellite positioning and marine survey services. Then someone at a recruitment consultant saw the word GPS and the word computing and the word French on my CV, and they invited me to apply for a position at Navtech, which is now here, HERE. And then that sort of took me into the world of global mapping databases and geospatial data mapping. And that was in the late 90s. So a few years later, I joined Laser Scan, which is now One Spatial. And I helped change the company name because we didn't do lasers and we didn't do scanning. Um, and they were a Navtech customer. And so I was part of a management buyout team there in 2003. And I helped to grow the relationship with Oracle, where we even got nominated as an ISV of the Year, independent software vendor, which was probably one of the successes because we were up against huge companies, with thousands of employees. And then I helped a number of junior staff to progress their careers. Now, I feel that's quite an achievement because some of them are not really getting an opportunity to step out of the role they were in. And then the other success I had there was we won a six-figure contract with TomTom to help develop and support their rules-based engine. And that came at a time, for anybody who's ever run a business, that came at a time when cash flow was really bad. So that helped with the cash flow. And now One Spatial is doing really, really well. And, they're a much bigger company. So go forward to sort of around about 2010. I joined the OGC and I helped create and drive the data quality working group, which still exists, and the business value committee. And that was for senior leaders to engage in the value and usefulness of open geospatial standards. And that's something I think is broadly missing across the whole of our sector, but we can come back to that. From there, I joined Ordnance Survey to set up their international business. I clinched a 10 million pounds plus contract in the Middle East, and I built a lot of relationships there and in Africa. And that really helped me when I started to get involved in UNGGIM around about 2012, the United Nations Committee on Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. So since that time, most of my successes have been around community development with scientists and policymakers, working with Earth observations, and most recently with the network of women practitioners from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, who are called Reseau Associates. So they're connected to my management consulting or management consultancy, which is Reseau Consulting. So I've done quite a random amount of stuff, some successes in sales, some successes in helping people build their careers, and successes in building communities. That's probably the way I'd split it. That
Well,
enough?
that's a great summary, Stephen, and it shows you're a multi-talented person. And I think what we're trying to do with these insight videos is to pick people like you and pull out their insights across various things. Because if you just spent your entire time in sales, you have one perspective, and often salespeople work on their own, so they don't do the kind of mentoring and business building that you have been involved in. You and I have spent a long time talking about over the years, and I think it's worth passing on to the students is the way in which Earth observation as an industry and geospatial actually interact. Now, at a technical level, you can say that there's software now that will integrate together imagery with detailed geospatial information. But in terms of messaging and in terms of the what I might call the institutional structures, still seem to be wide apart. They don't work. They don't play well together. And I'd just sort of like to get your take on how we might go about closing that gap. I think for the benefit of all parts of geospatial and Earth observation, doing things better.
So, like you said, I've been trying to influence this agenda or this broad integration for a decade. A big part of the problem is that geospatial data, including Earth observation, they're not seen as official data. So many countries defer or refer to national statistics first, and sometimes only do that. We now have frameworks for integration. We have case studies of different types of data being used together for policy and decision making, but we still haven't really made a breakthrough. I think it's still sort of fairly marginal. I've talked previously about policy literacy and human interoperability, and these are two areas I feel really strongly about, which basically boil down to education and collaboration with a big focus on awareness and continuous learning. And I think it's very difficult because the people who are involved, they know what they know and they assume that everyone else knows it. And the people who don't know what they don't know, well, they're never going to know. So that's why I say it comes down to sort of education and awareness and the collaboration. But it's got to be in a way sort of forced in both of these areas. And you've got to sort of like make it repetitive, and you've got to, I think it's a hands-on thing. You can't just talk at people. You have to, if I've got a policy brief and I've got someone very senior, whether they're a policymaker, whether they're a minister, or whether they're even someone even more senior than that, I think you have to sit down and really talk through it and just put it in context for them.
And I think one of the problems is that those policymakers often haven't got time and will circulate back to that. But this concept of human interoperability, I think sits at the key. So talk to me a little bit about what you mean by human interoperability and what are the key elements that can make that work?
I spent several years at the OGC where everyone talks, the Open Geospatial Consortium, where everyone talks about interoperability. And it's like, what do you mean by interoperability? Is it semantic interoperability? Is it syntactic? Is it data interoperability? Is it legal interoperability? Is it cultural? There are so many different types of interoperability. And for me, I've called it human interoperability because people are, nothing happens without people. People are data points. People are the ones who make the decisions whether or not we share data. If you get access to data, it's because of a human. So that cooperation and collaboration with people first is what I've been trying to do. So I did a couple of keynotes last year about human interoperability, and it was quite funny. I did one in Canada, and everybody was like, we wanted to talk about this topic, but we didn't know what to call it. Now we're going to call it human interoperability. And so an entire conference started using that term. So that's what I mean, trying to just think about, how do you motivate, how do you influence, how do you collaborate with people? Data changes, technology changes, science changes, but people fundamentally are, they're still making the same kinds of decisions and they always will. And they're either the facilitators or the blockers or the supporters.
And to me, I feel that there's a bit of a power struggle that goes on between Earth observation and geospatial people that seems to get in the way. How can we engineer human interoperability from the bottom up? Because it seems to me that the people at the top have their own fiefdoms, their own power bases, and they don't seem to be making it happen. So you've been at the bottom, but you've also been at the top. How do we engineer it bottom up?
I think a lot of it is about sort of common good. Like people talk a lot about digital public infrastructure, about, there's a lot of big terminology and a lot of people who get grant money because they have the big words in the terminology. And I think that that might actually stop with what we're seeing or happen over the pond with our friends, you know. So I'm trying to think about ways to bring people. I mean, I've been speaking to Ordnance Survey quite recently about exactly that. How do we bring the sort of the topographic mapping in as a contextual backdrop with Earth observation? I mean, it's very important, but for some reason, like you're saying, it's just not really happening. And so I think as we start to look at more and more things around biodiversity monitoring, climate change, mining, all of these different areas where it's going to impact big business like insurance and other areas, then we've been doing sort of environmental impact assessments and those things for a very long time. But I guess we're at the point now where we have so much data, civilian and private sector data from Earth observations that we can combine and we can start to do a lot of things that maybe you and I were thinking about 20 years ago. So it's finding that if we can find that common agenda, but bring people together in a room. Once I brought together the chief scientists of like about 10 big agencies, like really big agencies, and I brought together 10 chief economists, and we all sat in this room, and I was one of the moderators. And so they talked about, they had one set of language for the chief economists and one set of language for the chief scientists, but effectively we were talking about the same thing. So getting people in the room and doing more of that and sort of saying, look, could we collaborate and actually driving it, not just talking about it and having one set of people go, 700 people go and sit and talk about mapping and statistics, and another set of 700 people go and talk about Earth observations and what that means. Try and bring them together, whether it's at the bottom up, at the grassroots level where people are actually doing the work, if we're being fair, or go to the top level and bring the policymakers and decision makers together to talk about that. But I think getting people in the room, which you're pretty good at, Andy, I think trying to do more of that is really, really important. See the
So
whites of their eyes.
yeah, that's one thing, isn't it? Human beings are social animals, so we need to meet. And I think what you're saying is building on what I said. It's not just bottom up; it's top down. We need to do it both ways. But actually, the other thing that you've said that is critical is that we need to gear this around global problems, climate change, green energy, actually global security. These
Andy,
kind
I,
of
I, I go to like maybe 25, 30 countries a year, and I see the same thing in every country, just with a slight different element on the priority. So for some people, green energy is more important. For other people, it might be disaster risk reduction, but it's essentially the same five things that people are trying to address. So it's crazy that there's not more commonality around like how we do bring the different groups together to work on those things.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me, and of course, if you boil away those good things we've been talking about, money is pretty important. And again, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about this over the years. But when I look at the funding at the moment of initiatives like Copernicus, as part of the Green Deal in Europe, there's big amounts of money behind Copernicus, certainly compared with money that's behind geospatial, which tends to be very fragmented. It tends to be at the national level rather than at the pan-national level. And so what we need to do is to try and leverage that money. And I think it's going to be easier to leverage that money if we have some common messages. So it's what is your plan for actually getting to the money that I believe actually does exist, but we just don't seem to be able to get our hands on it.
I mean, there's a staggering amount of money in Horizon Europe. Um, there's been a lot of money for the Earth observation community through NASA ROSES, research opportunities in science. Um, there's other money. I think there's been a lot of money in science and research, and I think trying to move it more to the practical application beyond the science, or applied science. I think that's been something that we haven't really seen a huge shift towards. And part of the issue is that, projects or programs are 3 or 5 years and then that's it. So I'd love to see sort of much longer sustainable funding. But I think there's a few reasons why Earth observation probably gets a lot more funding than national mapping. I mean, space is something the public can associate with because we've put people on the moon and we have an international space station. And even if Earth observations are looking down from space, people still get excited with the word space. The second is that it's easier to recognize the infrastructure investments required for satellites or even for the in situ equipment. Data infrastructure is harder for people to envisage or to understand. I mean, it's been almost 20 years since the Landsat Open Data Agreement was signed, and it always feels that national mapping and statistical agencies are 10 years behind with cloud or crowd or open data. We wouldn't know about climate change without satellites. And I think one of the things is that maps have borders, Earth observations don't. So it's almost like less geopolitical in some ways to do that. So I think there's a number of different things that they might be wrong, but the perceptions are that space is this big, sexy, and national mapping just doesn't have that. And then to some extent, I think that's the result of national mapping not keeping up. I'm still dealing with the same people I was dealing with 20 years ago, so it's not the most dynamic sector. I would love to see a whole scale change and a lot more young people. I mean, people in their 30s, 20, maybe not 20s because you don't have that much experience, but certainly in your 30s and early 40s. I'd love to see a whole scale change of sort of leadership and some people to step back and maybe take more, maybe like a more consultative or advisory role. But all my friends who are mapping agencies are now going to be going, damn you, Ramage.
But no, I think you're right. But what you need to do is to empower that new management cadre with the skills that they need to be able to interact with policymakers and with decision makers in the private sector. And they don't seem to have that at the moment. And so part of what I'd like your advice on here is when we're in the certificate actually talking about geospatial leadership, what are some of the key hooks that we should be giving them? We're not going to be able to give them experience through, we can help them with our experience. And a lot of that is the elephant traps, the things that have gone wrong, rather than maybe the things that have gone right. But where should we be pointing them at that would be critical to their career moving forward?
I think you said it earlier on. I mean, most people in this area, I mean, it's a highly technical arena. So you have your technical knowledge. That could be, I mean, for me, it was spatial databases at One Spatial, with Ordnance Survey and those guys. With others in Earth observations, it's like, physics, maths, biogeochemistry. So everyone has some kind of like technical basis. And that's really, really important because you have to understand what the problems are as well as the opportunities. So don't underestimate that. That's the first thing is like try to think about how you can apply your technical skills and knowledge as you said, as you climb up the greasy pole of management. Think about, for me, I think it's always about thinking about the people below you and the people above you, and always just being in the middle and always interacting and just being the same at each level. Don't be rude or ignore the people below you because one day they'll be above you. And don't be too, be listen to your boss, have respect, but at the same time challenge them. Don't believe that everything they say is correct. So I think there's an element of being curious, There's an element of always trying to deliver on what you're working on. So for me, project and program delivery is the main focus. If you do that through your career, people will recognize that. You'll get kudos. You'll get a sense of satisfaction. And don't jump from one thing to the next. I think that's hard. What I see a lot, I mean, I mentor a lot of people. I mean, I've probably done over 250 mentoring sessions. And I get people who have done 1 to 2 years and then they're like, I feel I should move on. It's like, but what have you successfully done in this role? You know? And don't go into it just for you to learn. You have to give something back to the people who are paying your salary as well. So I do believe that you do need to do a bit more than just 1 to 2 years because you'll learn more as well and give back. But that project and program delivery, that's the key for me.
Right. That's great advice, Steve. Thanks for that. So one of the fun conversations that you and I had a while ago, but still sticks in my mind, is when you were at Geo, talking to the Emperor of Japan about Earth observation, and that is a challenge of taking something deeply technical, and I think we all have this, and expressing it in terms that a layperson, but a very influential one, actually can understand. So talk us through, the structure of that, because I think it can be beneficial for others to understand how to structure a conversation at that kind of level.
I've met and spent time with quite a few global leaders, like the president of Kenya, the former president or the former vice president of the USA, the emir of the UAE, the former prime minister of Germany, the vice president of Ghana, the Jordanian royal family, British prime ministers, and even, as you say, the now emperor of Japan. And I think it's always important to be polite and follow protocol, but it's also important to have your elevator pitch ready to speak about their national priorities in connection with your work. Provide the context to make it easier for them to understand and visualize or interpret what you're saying. So, with the Emperor of Japan, he's actually a water expert because Japan has all sorts of challenges around water. And he's been a United Nations, I guess, water ambassador. I don't know the right term, but he fundamentally understands. So when I met him and I was part of a delegation with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, um, it was almost like a surprise for me that I thought I was presenting to some, university and some other sort of senior level people in Japan. And then when someone told me, he's the future emperor of Japan, I was kind of like, I was a bit shell shocked, but you have to keep going. And I knew that he was a water ambassador, so I tried to talk about a lot of what we were doing around Earth observations in the context of water security. There was a thing we were working on at the time called GeoGlows, which is about stream flow forecasting. And there were other things that we were doing on water. So, and that was very, very well received. And, I even got a question from the Emperor of Japan. So yeah, that's one of the highlights of my career for sure.
What did you tell him, and how did you tell him it? So yeah, it's water. So what was your give us your elevator pitch that you actually gave to him about why he should be interested in Earth observation?
I think it was a couple of things. One was that this wasn't something developed in isolation with just one university or one agency. This was done across continents. So it was work that was done with NOAA in the US, with ECMWF in Europe, and with a number of different universities. And this was an operational system. So all of the code and all of the algorithms, everything was being made open source so people could sort of lift and shift. And we were doing that because the streamflow forecasting model could actually pick up smaller rivers and tributaries and stuff that you wouldn't typically get in a global model. So we talked around that, and we talked about the value this could bring to a country like Japan and how they could then cooperate with other international communities. So everyone has a different requirement, but some of them are broadly similar. So it was just talking about that investment has already been made to the tunes of many millions. And if they wanted to invest, whether it was money or whether it was people and time, the opportunity was there for them to contribute as well.
Yeah, so you got the money question in the end. Yeah, and I think it's also important that you don't just try to go straight for the money. I mean, the important thing that you've said there is there's other ways in which countries can contribute, because sometimes that's as valuable or even more valuable if they invest the time of the right people.
And
But
in my experience is if people see value in something, the money will come. If you go out chasing the money, it becomes a kind of a vicious circle where, you're still doing what you're doing, but then you've got this thing added on top where you're constantly chasing for money. I found if you meet people who have very similar goals and objectives in this similar domain, then it's like pushing an open door. But if they're not, you can spend a lot of time and energy trying to apply for money. I know people who've spent years trying to do that, and they've just gone to the people they perceive to be funders instead of doing more homework on what are their priorities. That's why I say when you meet senior people, what are the national government priorities, or what are even the priorities of their agency or their department? You can narrow it down and down and down until you get to something very finite. And that's always been something that I've probably done that now for the last 20 years of my career, and it's served me really well.
to finish off, just one interesting. There's a series of programs on Radio 4 at the moment, and my life would be boring if I didn't listen to it. And one they're doing is they've got people who they're saying, "What advice would you give to your younger self?" So, what advice would Steve Ramage now give to himself 30 years ago, when you were at the point where a lot of our students are in terms of building their career? They've come out of a technical niche. Now they've got to get into leadership big time.
Be patient. Be patient. I work for, as I said at the beginning, I work for Navtech. Um, they kept saying to me, "We're going to get bought. We're going to get bought." I mean, this is very much in the commercial sector, and I got fed up waiting, and I left, and I kind of like lost the right to my stock option or my share options, and then they did get bought, and I would have probably got about $5 million out of the deal. So that was that was one thing, because I was really impatient. I wanted to have like a bigger title on my role. I wanted to have more responsibility. But had I waited, then my life would have been fundamentally different.
But
Um,
would it have made you happy, Steve? You know that.
exactly, exactly. So that's kind of the first thing. I think the second thing is opportunities come along when you have a mortgage, you might have a young family, or you're in a relationship and you're supporting other people. And it's very tough. I mean, I do this a lot when we mentor, when I'm mentoring people, we chat through, well, what are the options, and will this opportunity come again? And I think what you find is whenever something looks too good, it is too good. So you don't have to jump at every opportunity that comes to you because it's some more money, or because it's some more responsibility, or because you get a bigger title. It might be linked to the be patient thing, but I think it's also about assess the opportunities. I mean, there will be a lot of opportunities will come in front of you during your career. I mean, I think if you put more in than you expect back, you'll be surprised at what does come back. And I've always had that. I've always tried to sort of what's the word? Just sort of over deliver. And if you can over deliver and do everything to your best of your ability, it's amazing what comes back to you. People appreciate you, you get promotions, you get other people offering you jobs. But you need to put in as much in as you expect back out. People who coast are never going to succeed.
That's brilliant, Steve. Thanks